I went to the county recorder's office on a Tuesday morning to transfer the deed of our house into my name alone, and the clerk looked at her screen, then looked at me and said, "Ma'am, there's already a lien on this property. Did you know your husband took out a loan against it? The outstanding balance is $4.3 million. I had not known. My name is Helen Marsh, and before all of this, I would have told you I was the least dramatic person I knew. 54 years old, retired middle school science teacher, living in a 3-bedroom house in Brentwood, Tennessee, the kind of suburb where the lawns are maintained and the neighbors bring soup when your husband dies. I had spent 31 years in front of a whiteboard explaining the water cycle and the periodic table, and I had found that satisfying in the deep, unflashy way that quiet work can be satisfying. I drove a Subaru Outback. I kept a bird feeder in the backyard. I was not someone who expected her life to detonate. My husband, Walter Marsh, had died 7 months before that Tuesday. A stroke, the doctors said. He had been in the kitchen, same as always on a Sunday morning, and then he was on the floor, and then he was gone. We had been married for 29 years. I won't pretend those years were without friction, but I had loved Walter the way you love something that has become the organizing structure of your days, without ceremony, without question. After he died, I did what surviving spouses do. I notified the bank. I called the insurance company. I sat with an estate attorney named Conrad Finch, who Walter had used for years, and who had a gentle manner and a firm handshake, and who helped me probate what I believed to be Walter's estate. A retirement account, a checking account, a savings account with roughly $18,000, some personal property, the house which was paid off, or so I had always believed, and which I intended to transfer into my name alone once the probate process was complete. I had made an appointment at the county recorder's office for a Tuesday morning in October. I brought the death certificate and the probate letters, and a folder of documents Conrad had prepared. I was calm. This was paperwork. I had done harder things. The clerk who helped me had reading glasses pushed up on her head and the brisk efficiency of someone who processed deeds all day. She typed in the parcel number and looked at her screen, and then the efficiency slowed. Her eyes moved to me and back to the screen twice before she spoke. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I'm seeing a deed of trust on this property. It was recorded 14 months ago. The lender is listed as Callaway Bridge Capital." I told her I didn't know what that was. "The loan amount at origination," she said, and she turned the monitor slightly so I could see, was $4,300,000. I remember the number perfectly. $4,300,000, secured against a house I thought we owned free and clear. She asked if I wanted her to print the recording documents. I said yes. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could drive. The documents were in my lap. Walter's signature was on every page. The date was 14 months ago, which meant he had done this 5 months before he died, and he had never once mentioned it. I drove home and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about 29 years of marriage. Walter had been a commercial insurance broker. He had his own agency, Marsh & Associates, which he had built over 2 decades. The income had been comfortable and consistent. We had paid off the house 12 years ago. We had sent our daughter, Faye, through college without debt. We had taken 2 vacations a year, nothing extravagant, but real vacations. Nothing about our financial life had ever suggested a reason to take a $4 million loan against our home. So where had $4,300,000 gone? And if he had needed it badly enough to put our house at risk, Why had he never told me? I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and I pulled at every thread I could find. The occasional late nights at the office I'd accepted without much thought. The second laptop he'd used for work that I'd assumed was just a work laptop. The way he'd deflected questions about the agency's financials with the casual ease of someone who had done it many times. I had trusted him completely. Now I sat in the dark and I wondered whether trust in my case had been indistinguishable from inattention. By 2 a.m, I was at the kitchen table with his files. Walter had kept physical records in a fireproof cabinet in the home office, and after he died, I had gone through them with Conrad to identify assets for the estate. I had found the retirement account documents, the insurance policies, the property deed that had shown no encumbrances at the time, or that I had believed showed no encumbrances. Now I went back through everything with different eyes. There was a folder I had set aside during probate because Conrad had said it appeared to be old agency correspondence. I opened it now. Inside were a series of letters and printouts related to something called Callaway Bridge Capital, LLC, the same name on the deed of trust. The letters were dated over 3 years. The most recent was 2 months before Walter died. The correspondence was not what I expected. It was not the paperwork of a lender and a borrower in a normal transaction. The language was careful in the way that language is careful when people are being careful not to say something directly. References to the arrangement, to Walter's continued participation, to the disbursement schedule being maintained through Q3, to ensuring the Brentwood property remained unencumbered until final settlement, which was a phrase that made no sense if Walter had already borrowed against the Brentwood property. I didn't understand what I was reading, but I understood enough to know I needed someone who would. I did not call Conrad Finch. Conrad had been Walter's attorney before he was mine, and sitting at that kitchen table at 2 a.m, that felt like the most important fact I knew. I needed someone who was mine alone. The next morning, I called my friend Josephine Lattimore, who had gone through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier and had mentioned her attorney in terms I had not forgotten. She said the woman had been like having a surgeon who also happened to be your most honest friend. Her name was Priya Chandrasekaran, and she practiced out of an office in Green Hills. I called her office when it opened at 8. I had an appointment by Thursday afternoon. In the meantime, I went to the public library, not my home computer, and I searched for Callaway Bridge Capital. It was registered in Nevada, which I would later learn means very little on its own. Thousands of entities use Nevada for registration. The registered agent was a firm in Las Vegas whose name appeared on hundreds of other entities. Beyond that, almost nothing public. Almost. The managing member, listed in a state business filing, was a man named Jeffrey Aldred. I knew that name. Jeffrey Aldred had been Walter's college friend, and the closest thing Walter had to a best man at our wedding. A role that had gone to Walter's brother only because Jeffrey had been out of the country on business. For the first 15 years of our marriage, Jeffrey had been a regular presence. Holidays, dinners, the occasional weekend, and then gradually he had faded out. Walter had told me that Jeffrey had gotten into some investments that hadn't ended well, that he'd had to put some distance between them professionally. I had accepted that. I had not pressed. Now I sat in a library in Brentwood, Tennessee, and I thought about Jeffrey Aldred and $4.3 million and a deed of trust that Walter had signed without telling me. I made a decision in that library chair. I was not going to tell Faye yet. Faye was 26, living in Chicago, and she had adored her father. I wasn't ready to say something that couldn't be unsaid until I understood what I was saying. I was not going to tell anyone. I was going to find a lawyer, and I was going to find out what Callaway Bridge Capital actually was before I took a single visible step. Priya Chandrasekharan's office was spare and organized in the way of someone who does not need to impress you with objects. She was in her early 40s, South Indian American, with the quality of attention that made you feel like every word you said was being cataloged for later use. I laid everything out in the order it had happened: the recorder's office, the deed of trust, the folder of correspondence. Jeffrey Aldred. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked whether Walter had left a will. He had. I had probated it myself with Conrad's help. The estate, as valued at the time, had been just under $200,000. The house had been listed as an asset, but the deed of trust had not appeared in the title search Conrad had run, or if it had, he had not brought it to my attention. Priya's expression didn't shift, but her pen touched the legal pad once. She explained that a deed of trust recorded in the county records should have appeared in any competent title search. She said she wanted to understand why it hadn't, and she said it gently, but the implication was clear. The more pressing question, she said, was what Callaway Bridge Capital actually did and where the money had gone. She had a forensic accountant she worked with regularly, a former FBI financial crimes analyst named Stuart Oakes. She recommended engaging him. I agreed and signed the retainer that afternoon. What followed were the strange weeks of living a double life. Every morning, I drove to the grocery store or the library or the coffee shop where I had been going for years, and every evening I sat with documents and questions I couldn't discuss with anyone. And then, 10 days after my visit to Priya's office, things became less abstract. A car I didn't recognize had been parked across the street from my house for 2 evenings in a row. A gray Audi, Tennessee plates, parked slightly differently each time but unmistakably the same car. I noticed it the way you notice something your instincts have decided matters before your conscious mind catches up. Then a phone call from a number I didn't know, which disconnected the moment I answered. And then a voicemail, left at 11:30 at night, from a man who said only that he was an old colleague of Walter's and that he had heard I was looking into some business matters, and he hoped we could sit down and clear some things up. I did not call back. I called Priya and described everything. She told me to document it all and said that the pattern was consistent with someone monitoring what I was doing. She told me to be careful about what I searched at home and to vary my routes. Stuart Oakes completed his initial analysis in 4 weeks and presented his findings in Priya's conference room. He was a compact, precise man in his 50s who had the manner of someone who had spent years being the person in the room who understood the numbers when no one else did. He set his folder on the table and walked me through it without preamble. Callaway Bridge Capital was not a traditional lender. It was a vehicle. Over 7 years, it had served as an intermediary for routing undeclared compensation to a small group of insurance professionals who had participated in a scheme involving 3 regional property and casualty carriers. The arrangement involved the deliberate misclassification of commercial policy risk levels, which allowed the carriers to collect higher premiums from policy holders, while routing a portion of the excess to entities like Callaway Bridge, through what appeared on paper to be consulting agreements and bridge financing arrangements. Walter had been one of the participating brokers. He had been submitting altered risk assessments for a specific category of commercial clients for at least 6 years. The compensation had come in irregular amounts, paid through Callaway Bridge, which had then loaned the money back to Walter through the deed of trust, a structure designed to make the payments look like legitimate real estate financing rather than undisclosed compensation. The $4.3 million was not a loan Walter had taken out because he needed money. It was the accumulated proceeds of 6 years of fraudulent activity, structured to look like a mortgage, so that if anyone ever asked, there was a paper trail that led to a Nevada lender and not to the insurance carriers who had been paying him. Jeffrey Aldred had built the structure. Walter had participated in it, and the deed of trust on my house existed because Jeffrey had needed a way to document the final distribution, and Walter had provided the asset. I sat in Priya's conference room and I felt the specific nausea of understanding something you cannot unknow. Stewart said there was more. 2 of the 3 carriers had been under quiet examination by state insurance regulators for the past 8 months. Jeffrey Aldred was almost certainly aware of this. The voicemail I had received, the car on my street, these were not coincidences. Jeffrey knew I had been to the recorder's office. He was trying to assess what I knew and how much of a problem I was going to be. Priya said when Stewart finished, "Helen, we need to talk about timing. Because whoever left that voicemail already knows you've started asking questions. That means the window where you control this is narrowing." She laid out the options clearly. The deed of trust on my house was technically a valid lien. If Jeffrey or his attorneys moved first with a civil claim, or if federal investigators opened a case without my prior involvement, my position became significantly more complicated regardless of my innocence. The path that best protected me was voluntary disclosure to the appropriate regulatory bodies, specifically the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance, and, given the scale and the interstate nature of the scheme, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Voluntary disclosure before an investigation was opened carried documented legal protections. It would also establish my status as a cooperating witness rather than a subject. Priya had done this before. She knew the process. She filed the initial disclosure paperwork on a Friday afternoon. Stewart prepared a financial summary to accompany it. By the following Monday, Priya had spoken with a special agent named Marcus Tillman at the Nashville field office, who received the disclosure and asked us to hold pending a preliminary review. I drove home that evening and made dinner, chicken soup from a recipe I had been making since Faye was small. I sat at the table alone and thought, I have done something that cannot be undone. There was grief in that, because undoing something meant acknowledging that Walter was no longer someone I was protecting. But underneath the grief, quieter and more solid, was something I recognized as agency I had chosen. After months of being acted upon by events I hadn't known were happening, I had acted. I slept 4 hours that night. It was the best sleep I had managed since the recorder's office. The call came on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the disclosure. I was in the backyard filling the bird feeder when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I had been answering unknown numbers since Priya told me to document everything. The voice was warm and familiar and immediately placed me back 15 years to a dinner. In this same backyard, Walter laughing at something Jeffrey had said, me passing around bread and thinking we were fortunate people. Helen, just my name, said in the particular way of a man who has calculated exactly how much weight a single syllable can carry. I think it's time we talked. I kept my voice even. "Jeffrey," I said, "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." He said he had been worried about me. He said he understood I had been through a tremendous amount, and that grief made people do things they might not otherwise do, like ask questions that could open doors better left closed. He said he hoped I was taking care of myself. I asked him what he actually wanted. There was a pause. He said he wanted to offer me some clarity. He said the business arrangement Walter had participated in was complicated in ways that a person looking at documents from the outside might misread. He said there were people involved whose patience was not unlimited, and that my conversations with certain offices had not gone unnoticed, and that if I were to reconsider the directions it was taking, he believed we could arrive at a resolution that protected my interests. He said the word protected, the way people say words when they mean their opposite. I asked him to be specific. What exactly was he suggesting I reconsider? He said, very quietly, that Walter had not been the only one who had benefited from the arrangement, that my standard of living for the past 6 years, the vacations, the cars, the ease, had been underwritten in part by the arrangement's proceeds, that a prosecutor looking at this case might not see a widow who knew nothing. They might see a woman who had chosen not to look too closely. It was a precise threat. He had thought about it carefully. I could tell, because the words came in the right order, with the right pauses, the way things come out when they have been rehearsed. I told him that all further contact should go through my attorney's office, and I ended the call. I stood in the backyard with the bird feeder in my hand, and I breathed. Then I went inside and called Priya and repeated every word. She was not surprised. "He is doing what cornered people do," she said. "He is trying to make you feel exposed so that you will act out of fear instead of strategy. The fact that he called you personally rather than through legal counsel tells me he doesn't have clean standing. If he did, you'd be hearing from his attorney, not from him. She advised me to prepare a written account of the call and send it to her immediately." I did. 3 days later, through Priya's office, Jeffrey Aldred's attorney made contact, requesting a meeting to discuss the estate matters informally. Priya declined, politely and without explanation. We heard nothing more that week, but the threat had landed and it stayed with me. He was not wrong that my position could be made to look complicated to someone who wanted it to look that way. That was the thing about being used without your knowledge. The use leaves marks that look, to the uninformed eye, like participation. I took a few days and drove down to my sister's house in Chattanooga. Nadine, my older sister, who had always been the steadier of the two of us. I told her I was managing some complicated legal matters related to Walter's estate and that I needed to be somewhere that wasn't my kitchen for a few days. She didn't press. We sat on her back porch and watched her 2 dogs run in the yard, and she made her chicken and dumpling soup that she has been making since we were girls. And I let myself be a person for a little while instead of a case. When I came back, I found a card in my mailbox from my neighbor across the street, Gwen Travers, a retired nurse who had lived there for as long as I had. The card said only, "Thinking of you. Your porch light has been on every night. That's a good sign." I stood in the driveway and held that card and felt something give way just briefly. Small acts of ordinary kindness can locate you when you've been feeling very far from yourself. Then Faye called. Faye was not asking about the estate. She had been asking careful, gentle questions since Walter died, the questions of a daughter who knows something is being kept from her and has decided to wait until you're ready. She said only that she had been thinking of me and that she wanted to come home for a weekend soon. I told her yes. Not yet, but yes. and then Walter's business partner reached out. His name was Douglas Keener, and he had been with Marsh & Associates for 11 years. He and Walter had not been close personally, but they had worked side by side, and Douglas had been respectful and helpful in the weeks after Walter died, managing the agency transition without involving me more than necessary. His email was warm and expressed that he had been thinking about me and about the agency's direction, and that he had some ideas he'd love to share that might provide some financial clarity for me going forward. I read the email 3 times. I forwarded it to Priya with one line. "Is this connected?" Priya called within the hour. She had already been looking at Douglas Keener. He had been Jeffrey Aldred's contact point at the agency for at least 4 years. Several of the altered risk assessments Stewart had identified had gone through Douglas's client files before being submitted under Walter's license. Whether Douglas had participated knowingly or had been managed without his awareness was still unclear, Priya said. But his timing was not coincidental. He was checking what I knew, or he was carrying a message. I wrote back to Douglas. I told him I appreciated him reaching out, that I was in the middle of some legal business related to the estate, and that I would be in touch when things settled. Polite, opaque, non-committal. He replied within 30 minutes, very warm, very understanding. No pressure at all. "Of course," he said, "whenever you're ready." The speed of the reply told me everything I needed to know. Priya had recommended some weeks earlier, in the practical way that she recommended things, that I find a therapist not for crisis intervention, but for the sustained stress of a legal process that had no clear end date. I took the advice. A woman named Dr. Claire Beaumont, whose office was near Vanderbilt. She was dry and practical, and had worked with clients in financial trauma before and did not treat me like I was fragile. Seeing her every 2 weeks became something I relied on in a way I hadn't anticipated. I also talked to Gwen Travers. Not about the full situation, not about the details. Priya had advised keeping financial specifics private, but about the loneliness of grief, about the particular disorientation of feeling like the person you had organized your life around had turned out to have rooms you were never shown. Gwen had been a widow for 6 years, and she listened in the way of someone who has no agenda except to hear you. She said something one evening on my porch that I have not stopped thinking about. She said, "The fact that you didn't see it doesn't mean you were blind. It might mean he was careful. Those are different things." I had needed to hear that distinction more than I had known. Agent Tillman reached out through Priya 6 weeks after the initial disclosure. The FBI had opened a formal investigation into the scheme and its participants. My cooperative status was confirmed and documented. It would be a long process, Tillman said. These investigations always were. Jeffrey Aldred's side went quiet after the initial attempts at contact, but I did not take that for surrender. Men like Jeffrey Aldred, Priya said, do not walk away from what they consider their money without trying every available approach first. They simply become more patient and more indirect. I locked my doors. I documented everything. I called Priya every week, and I waited with a steadiness that I had not known I was capable of before any of this happened. They came on a Saturday. I saw the car from the kitchen window, a rented black SUV, pulling up to the curb in a way that was just slightly too deliberate, the way rental cars sit when people are performing normalcy they don't feel. Jeffrey got out first from the passenger side. He was in his early 60s now, heavier than I remembered from the wedding photos, silver-haired, wearing the easy clothes of a man who has never had to think about cost. He carried a paper bag from a bakery I recognized, the kind of gesture meant to say, This is a social call. Douglas Keener came around from the driver's side. That surprised me. I had not expected Douglas. I watched them walk up the front path. I thought about Walter at the kitchen table 14 months ago, signing a deed of trust on the house we had owned together for 22 years, and not saying a word to me. Then I opened the door before they could knock. Helen. Jeffrey's face arranged itself into the expression of a man paying a condolence call. You look wonderful. I should have called ahead, I know. But we were both thinking about you, and it just felt like the right thing. I did not step back. I stood in the doorway and said pleasantly, Jeffrey, Douglas, this is a surprise. We should have called, Jeffrey said. But we were worried. I let them in because Priya had told me. If they approach you in person, let them talk, document everything, commit to nothing. We sat in the living room. Jeffrey set the bakery bag on the coffee table. Douglas sat forward with his elbows on his knees, in the manner of a man trying to project sincerity. Jeffrey spoke first. He was skilled. I had to grant him that. He talked about Walter, about their friendship, about the pressures Walter had been under in the last years of the agency, about decisions made under difficult circumstances by a good man who had ultimately gotten in over his head. He framed the entire arrangement in the language of unfortunate necessity, regulatory pressures, impossible clients, a system that left brokers with impossible choices. The situation with the property, he said eventually, is complicated. I want you to understand that. There are parties who have expectations about how this resolves, and the path you're on right now, involving federal investigators, that path doesn't protect you. It exposes you. Walter would not have wanted this for you. Douglas nodded and added that there were options that could settle everything privately and cleanly. Options that would allow me to keep the house and avoid what he called the spectacle of a federal process. I looked at him, then at Jeffrey. What you're suggesting, I said, is that I withdraw from cooperation with a federal investigation. Jeffrey shifted. I'm suggesting, he said, that there's a resolution that works for everyone, a private resolution. And if I declined, he looked at me with the particular expression of a man who has decided patience is its own kind of threat. Helen, he said. Walter stayed in this a long time past when it made sense, and things became very difficult for him near the end. I wouldn't want the same for you. Walter's stroke had been sudden and severe. The doctors had said it was consistent with years of hypertension and stress. I had never questioned that. Now Jeffrey was sitting in my living room implying something I could not yet prove, and I was filing that implication away in a part of my mind that had gone very cold and very still. You should direct any further contact to my attorney, I said. Her name is Priya Chandrasekaran. I'll text you the number. I stood up. Jeffrey stayed seated for a moment longer than was comfortable. Douglas looked at his hands. You're making a mistake, Jeffrey said. Possibly, I said. But it's mine to make. They left. I locked the front door and stood in the hallway with my back against the wall, and I breathed. Then I picked up my phone and called Priya and told her every word. She said the in-person visit was significant. She said it told her they believed the evidence was more dangerous to them than they had initially estimated. She said to expect quiet for a while as they recalculated. She was right about the quiet. 4 weeks of it. Long enough for me to almost believe the pressure had passed. Then the deposition notices arrived. The formal process moved through the winter. I was deposed in January in a conference room at the FBI field office on Brick Church Pike. Present were Agent Tillman, a DOJ attorney named Harriet Bowles, who had joined the case in December, Priya, and a court reporter who typed everything with the focused stillness of someone who has heard many things and been moved by none of them. I answered every question Priya and I had prepared for, and several we hadn't, and through all of it I told the truth, because the truth was the only thing I had that could not be taken from me. When it was over, Harriet Bowles looked at me across the table and said, "Mrs. Marsh, your cooperation has been noted and will be reflected in our recommendations." It was not much, but it was something, and Priya allowed herself a small, quiet smile in the elevator going down, and I held on to that. Jeffrey Aldred's deposition took place 6 weeks later. I was not in the room, but I learned what happened from Priya, who had been informed through the process. Jeffrey arrived with 2 attorneys and the composure of a man who had sat in difficult rooms before. He was prepared and careful through the initial questioning, maintaining the position that Callaway Bridge Capital had been a legitimate advisory and lending operation, and that the compensation arrangements with participating brokers had been within regulatory norms. Then Stuart Oakes's documentation was introduced. Wire transfer records, internal emails between Callaway Bridge and the 3 carriers. A series of communications recovered from Walter's work laptop that had been in his office at the agency and had been subpoenaed along with the agency's records. The communications were direct. They referenced the usual allocation. They referenced routing through Brentwood to keep it clean. That phrase, to keep it clean. Priya read it to me over the phone later, sitting in her car in the parking garage, because neither of us wanted to walk back into the world with that sentence still in the air. Walter had put my house in the arrangement not to protect it for us. He had done it because a residential deed of trust from a long-married couple in Brentwood looked like ordinary collateral. He had used the house, and by extension me, as cover, because I made the transaction look clean. 29 years of marriage, and he had looked at my name on a deed and seen camouflage. When those communications were placed in front of Jeffrey Aldred, his attorneys called for 2 breaks. He returned from each one looking slightly less composed than before. A man who had built his professional life on the ability to shape narrative, discovering that documents do not respond to narrative. They do not move. They do not adjust based on tone. By the end of the session, he had invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination on 14 occasions. He had contradicted his own prior statements on 6 documented points. His attorneys filed a motion the following morning, seeking to have certain evidence excluded. The motion was denied. Douglas Keener was interviewed separately as a cooperating witness. He had, it turned out, known about the scheme, but had participated at the margins, primarily by ensuring the altered filings passed through his client queue without flagging. His cooperation with investigators in the weeks after Jeffrey's failed visit to my house had apparently been substantive enough to reduce his exposure significantly. I did not know what to do with that information. I filed it and left it alone. The formal findings came on a Friday afternoon. Priya called me while I was in the backyard. Helen Marsh, she said, had been classified as a non-culpable third party. There was no evidence that I had known about the scheme, participated in it, or benefited from it with knowledge of its nature. The deed of trust would be removed from the property. My home was mine. I stood in the backyard holding my phone and I said, "Thank you," and for a moment I couldn't say anything else. The relief was enormous and it was not simple. Being found innocent is not the same as finding peace. It does not give you back the version of your marriage you thought you had. It does not answer the question of whether Walter had loved me differently than I had believed, or whether love and deception can coexist in a person in ways that don't resolve cleanly. Those questions did not have clean answers, and I was learning to leave them in the category of things I would sit with for a long time without requiring resolution. But the truth was on record, in a federal building, and that was not nothing. The indictment came down in March. Jeffrey Aldred was charged on 7 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, insurance fraud, obstruction, and 2 counts of structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements. His attorneys began negotiating within the week. The plea agreement, which Harriet Bowles outlined for Priya in April, included a sentencing recommendation of 9 years in federal prison and the forfeiture of assets attributable to the scheme. Among them, a house in Belle Meade, 2 investment properties in Florida, a sailboat he kept in a marina in Destin that Stewart had mentioned once with the dry precision of a man who has never owned a sailboat but has thought about what it represents. Douglas Keener received a reduced charge in exchange for his cooperation and was sentenced to 18 months of federal probation and a substantial fine. He surrendered his insurance license. The question of the deed of trust was resolved over the following months through a process that Priya managed with Stewart's help and coordination with the DOJ and the state insurance regulators. The $4.3 million had been entirely fraudulent in origin. There was no legitimate loan. The lien was vacated. The property reverted to its prior unencumbered status. Beyond that, the estate had been substantially undervalued because the agency itself, Marsh & Associates, held assets that had not been disclosed in the original probate, including a small commercial property in East Nashville held in the agency's name that had been acquired with scheme proceeds. After the forfeiture proceedings, a portion of that property's equity, representing the legitimate value Walter had contributed through his actual brokerage work over the years, was determined to be distributable to the estate. It was not a dramatic sum, but it was real, and it was clean, and it was mine. I kept the house. I had considered selling it briefly in the first months after I understood what Walter had done there, what he had signed in that kitchen without telling me. But the house was 22 years of my life, too. It was the yard where Faye had learned to ride a bike, and the kitchen where I had made every holiday meal I could remember, and the porch where Gwen and I had started what had become a genuine friendship. I was not going to let Walter's choices take that from me. What I did change was the study. Walter had used it as a home office, and after the probate and the deposition and all of it, I went in one Saturday with a can of paint in a color I had been thinking about for years, a deep teal, the color of the water in the photographs, from a trip I had taken to the Pacific Northwest in my 20s before I was married, before I was anyone's wife. Walter had always said it was too dark for the room. I painted it myself with the windows open and a playlist of everything I had wanted to listen to, and no one to weigh in on the choices. When I finished, I stood in the doorway and looked at the color, and felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the sensation of being returned to yourself. Faye came home in May for 4 days. We had talked in pieces over the months, carefully, with me giving her what I could as the legal process allowed. Now I told her the whole of it over 2 evenings on the back porch. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. She was angry at her father with the clean, specific anger of a daughter who has had her understanding of a person restructured, and I recognized that anger because I had felt it too, and I did not try to soften or redirect it. I just sat with her in it. We had a meal and a bottle of wine, and we talked until midnight, not only about this, but about her life in Chicago, her relationship, the things she was figuring out. Before she left, she hugged me at the door for a long time and said, "I'm proud of you, Mom. I am not ashamed to say I held on to that for weeks." Jeffrey Aldred entered a federal correctional facility in June. I read the news item on my phone while I was having coffee on the porch in the early morning light with the birds coming to the feeder. I set the phone down and watched a pair of cardinals for a while. There was nothing more I needed to feel about Jeffrey Aldred. He had made his choices across many years and many rooms, and the consequences had assembled themselves accordingly. What I felt about my own life in those weeks after the final resolution was something I had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief exactly, though relief was in it. Something more like solidity. The particular groundedness of a person who has been tested in ways she didn't choose and has discovered that she is more durable than she knew. I started a Master Gardening Certificate program at Vanderbilt that fall. I had always tended the backyard in a casual way, but I wanted to understand it properly. The soil, the seasonality, the systems. There is something about learning how things actually work, the real mechanisms underneath what you can see, that appealed to me in a new way after everything. I spent Saturday mornings in a classroom and Sunday mornings in the yard, and both felt like forms of the same attention. Gwen and I started walking on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. 3 miles through the neighborhood at a pace that allowed conversation. We talked about everything and nothing, about her grandchildren and my garden and the books we were reading, and the things that had surprised us about getting older. It became one of the reliable pleasures of my week, the kind of small ritual that turns out to be load-bearing. Dr. Beaumont and I shifted after the legal process concluded from stress management into something more like the considered work of understanding my own patterns. I had spent a long time, I came to understand, accommodating, making myself legible and convenient. Not asking for the full accounting, because asking felt like distrust, and I had confused trusting someone with not requiring transparency from them. Those were not the same thing. Learning the difference slowly in that spare office near Vanderbilt was not comfortable and was entirely worthwhile. I booked a trip to Scotland for the following spring. I had wanted to go since I was 23 years old, had read about it in a magazine at my dentist's office, and thought, someday. Someday had been deferred for 29 years by one reason or another. I booked it alone, a small rental cottage in the Highlands for 2 weeks, and I planned to do nothing organized and nothing efficient. To walk, to sit, to read. To watch weather come in over the hills. Faye said she might meet me for the last few days if her schedule allowed. I told her I hoped she would. On the morning I booked the flight, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I thought about the woman who had driven home from the county recorder's office 7 months earlier, sitting in her car in the driveway for 20 minutes because she couldn't make herself go inside. I thought about what she had known and what she hadn't known, and the long distance between those 2 points. I did not ask for any of what happened to me. I did not choose the marriage Walter turned out to have, or the arrangement Jeffrey Aldred had built, or the deed on my house, or the months of fear and documentation and waiting. None of that had been mine to choose. But every decision I made once I knew, those had been mine. The library instead of the home computer, Priya instead of Conrad, the disclosure instead of the private deal, the teal paint on the study wall, the trip to Scotland, mine, entirely and without negotiation. If you had been in that recorder's office, if the clerk had turned that screen toward you and shown you something that unmade everything you thought you knew, What would you have done? I want to know. Leave me a comment. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. I'm Nora, and thank you for being here.